The toughest ones are usually the Puka Nakuas, the Jamar Chases, the Jackson Smith and Jigbas. These were the only guys that were seeing like consistent week over week, double-digit targets. Those are like the hardest types to fade.
Especially as we get later into the season, you can use the Fantasy Points data suite to sort of get an idea of which wide receivers have the best red zone roles. And sometimes that can also include like looking at which guys are playing the most in the red zone. I know that's something we've talked about with a guy like Josh Downs, where, you know, outside of the 20s, he's out there for maybe 75% of snaps, but then inside the 20s, that drops to something like 50%. So even on the weeks where a guy like Josh Downs projects pretty well, it's like, okay, well, he's getting these lower A-dot targets. He's explosive, but probably not explosive enough to break off a long catch, and he's not really earning much of a red zone role. I feel pretty comfortable fading a guy like that because he's not going to bury you with multiple touchdowns. He probably won't hit the 100-yard bonus.
Welcome to the off-season edition of DFS Deep Dive, where our experts pull back the curtain on how they and you can leverage all our tools at Fantasy Points DFS to level up your process and make money. I am Ryan Heath, joined by Jake Tribbey, and today we are discussing ownership. Where can you find our projected ownership numbers? What should it mean for your strategy in DFS when you hear someone like Jake or myself say a player is going to be chalky or highly owned? And how does that change for different positions and different archetypes of players? We are covering all of that today. But first, as always, I've got to remind you that if you want access to the most accurate projections in the industry after 2025, as well as all of our other DFS content like Scott Barrett's Slate Breakdown, my Advanced Matchups article, and our UFL DFS content and projections led by Jake Tribbey here, the best spring football analyst in the world, you've got to go to fantasypoints.com/plans and use code DFS at checkout. Through the end of March 2027, that'll give you access to every DFS article and tool from our team designed to help you win. And we know it works. We've had a subscriber win the Millie Maker during each of the past 3 years. We are just doing a show all about ownership today. We have our DFS projections page up here on the screen with Jake on the screen share. And you might say, well, Ryan, why do you even have this up? There are no ownership projections. There's no ownership numbers on the screen right now. We know it's because it is the Super Bowl. It's a one-game slate. We don't always have ownership for one-game slates, especially several days out ahead of the Super Bowl when we are recording this. So we do not have a very good example to show you, but we can at least show you this is where ownership will be every single week during the NFL season for the main slate. We will have ownership projections on this page for every single player. They typically have a first run come out on Thursday. They will be updated as we approach the weekend. They will also load right into our optimizer at Fantasy Points or into any other external tool. If you download these projections to a CSV, you'll get the ownership numbers in there as well. So yeah, just Jake, anything you want to add kind of just in navigating this page or in using our ownership numbers, things that people should keep in mind, especially if they're maybe newer to DFS and don't immediately understand what it is we're talking about when we say ownership?
Yeah, so I mean, just a basic definition, ownership would be the percentage of lineups in whatever contest that you're playing include a particular player. So especially when you're like brand new to DFS, you might think, why does that even matter? Shouldn't I just be playing the guys who score the most fantasy points? And, I think to give like a really extreme example here, imagine you have Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow both projected for the same number of fantasy points, and you're playing in a 100-man contest, and you think 99 people in that contest will be playing Justin Herbert, and only one will be playing Joe Burrow. Well, obviously, you'd want to play Joe Burrow because if Joe Burrow outperforms Justin Herbert, all of a sudden you have the edge on 99% of the field. That's a very extreme example. You won't see it quite unfold like that in an actual DFS contest, but I do think that helps illustrate sort of the importance of ownership and why finding low-owned plays who you want to include in your lineups is important, and why it's also important to just have a good grasp on ownership. And obviously our ownership projections done by Darren Manser, who does a really great job, are a really great way to help you gauge sort of who the most popular plays in the week will be.
I think like the simplest way to put it is that like the lower ownership a guy is going to see in a contest, kind of the more his fantasy points like help you if he's going to be one of the only ones scoring fantasy points, just because fewer people in the contest are benefiting from it. If you're one of the only people that has a low-owned Joe Burrow, then you are just sliding even further up the leaderboard from his 28 fantasy points than you would with a higher-owned quarterback that scores the exact same amount of fantasy points. Also, you want to keep in mind, especially if you are playing tournaments, GPPs, where the prize pools are concentrated up at the top at the first few places. You want to come in first place to get by far the biggest prize. You want to make sure you're submitting a unique lineup. That's easier to do than you might think, even in some of these tournaments that have more than 1,000 entrants. It is like if you are making any sort of effort to have a unique lineup, you probably will. It's pretty rare that I find myself running into dupes, at least on like a bigger 8 to 10 to 12 game main slate. It's not usually too hard to be unique, but it is something you need to understand. Like just having one kind of single digit ownership guy is going to make it a lot less likely that you run into duplicates and that you end up having to split a prize pool if you do end up coming in first or placing very well in a contest.
I would just add to that, like Ryan noted, dupes are very unlikely on a main slate. I mean, if you submit like the cash game optimal into a large field tournament, you will certainly get duplicated. But even if you're just like a player or two away from the optimal, I mean, there are so many combinations on an 8, 10, 12 game main slate. Dupes generally aren't a concern. But if you're playing something like a 3, 4 game slate or less, especially Showdown, dupes all of a sudden do become a real consideration, and obviously playing lower owned players does reduce your chance at submitting a duplicate lineup. And the reasons duplicate lineups are so bad is because winning a contest is very unlikely. Even if you're really good, it's really hard to do. It's very unlikely. And if you do get fortunate enough to win a contest, you don't want to have to split that first place prize money with anyone else. It's just way higher EV to submit lineups that aren't duplicated versus lineups that are duplicated, generally speaking. So yeah, that is something to keep in mind really for smaller slates. If you're just playing main slates, duplicates are not a big concern as long as you're just not submitting the cash game optimal.
Getting into kind of just the strategy around ownership and what I'm thinking when I'm using ownership numbers and building lineups, the first thing I would say is that I think at least it's my impression, as well as just looking at my own play in terms of when I was getting into playing DFS for the first time. I think it's way more common of a mistake and a way easier pitfall to fall into to be getting too galaxy brain and to be trying to be too different from the field rather than like not getting different enough. So even in like larger field tournaments with more than 1,000 or 2,000 entrants, some of the best lineups and the best EV lineups can literally be like something close to the chalk or the cash core of a given slate, minus like 1 or 2 kind of off the wall plays that are substituted in, especially if they're correlated in intelligent ways. You don't have to play a lineup even like predominantly including lower owned guys. A lot of the guys in your lineups should be some of the higher owned players, because every season, I've noticed this every season that I have been in the industry, every season it gets sharper. The industry gets sharper. Ownership is better. Jake has been playing DFS longer than me. He might have stories of like obviously bad plays getting like 50% ownership on main slates. That doesn't really happen anymore. If a guy is going to be highly owned on an NFL main slate, he's probably a pretty good play, and there's probably pretty good reason for it. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that ownership can almost be a proxy for is this guy a good play or not. That's obviously going to be connected to his projection, to his fantasy points per dollar, and all of that. But it should not be like your automatic response of, oh, he's really chalky, so I'm going to fade him. I think that's something that people run into. It's easy to run into that. It makes you feel special. It makes you feel smart. You're being different, but that it's not the way to find success in DFS, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, the best plays are the best plays for a reason, and those are guys that you obviously want to mix into your lineups, but you just have to do it intelligently. So, it's generally very week dependent, very slate dependent. What's good chalk, what's bad chalk? I know we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly, Ryan. But yeah, I would not be, just because I see that Bijan Robinson is 40% owned, that doesn't mean I don't want to play him. It probably just means I'm getting unique in another spot in my lineup.
Let's talk about good and bad chalk. So I find this helpful to go through this kind of exercise mentally during a slate where I'm going to look at the top few guys at each position that we are projecting for the most ownership, that we expect are going to be the most popular. And I want to decide, okay, are they good or bad chalk, which to me means do they deserve that ownership, and what do I think their optimal ownership is? So if Bijan Robinson on a slate has 40% ownership, I might think he's an even better play than that. I might think, wow, he's actually should be 60% owned. I'm going to play 60%. I'm going to go over the field. That's another way that you can especially if you're MMEing, submitting 20, 100, 150 lineups, that's another way that you can kind of express your opinion against the field. So I like to do that. I like to decide on a case-by-case basis, is each guy good or bad chalk? And if they're bad, then maybe my one pivot in that lineup can be something that benefits from a scenario in which they fail. Let's say Bijan Robinson, since he's the guy we keep saying is 40%. If I think he's bad chalk, Drake London is only projected for 7% ownership. A possible pivot is I'm just going to play Drake London instead of Bijan Robinson in this lineup. If it's Drake London that catches 2 touchdowns and Bijan stays out of the end zone, then that's an awesome pivot. I just got all that leverage on the field because they are playing 40% Bijan Robinson. Most of them do not have Drake London. And that can honestly be one of the only big stands you take against the field in a lineup. And it can be a really good and plus EV type of lineup. So yeah, anything else on good and bad chalk? Maybe what you're thinking when you're making that determination, Jake?
Yeah, I would say that it is fairly position dependent. The biggest thing for me when I'm sort of determining good versus bad chalk is when I'm looking through the highest owned players, I'm just thinking, can this guy bury me? Is this a guy that I will absolutely need to have if he hits his, a top 2 percentile outcome, something like that? And if Khalil Shakir is going to be 20% owned, the answer is probably not. If Jamar Chase is going to be 20% owned, the answer is yeah, absolutely. So it's very player dependent. It can even be slate dependent. But yeah, that is sort of the main way that I view chalk, is just can this guy absolutely bury me in a tournament? And, if he's popular and I think the answer is yes, then that's probably a guy I'll want to lean into a little bit.
Almost counterintuitively, I do think the temptation when you see a high ownership player is well, how could they fail like that? But I agree with you that the better question to ask is because we're playing DFS tournaments where all of the prizes are paid out to the top percent finishers, it is actually, can they bury me? Is their ceiling reflective of this ownership? That's the first question I'm always asking as well.
Right, and you can sort of frame it in what is the percentage chance that they bury me this week? If Jamar Chase is going to be 40% owned, is there a 40% chance that you absolutely have to have Jamar Chase? Most weeks the answer is probably yes, especially if he's in a great matchup and the offense is playing well. And then for a guy like Khalil Shakir, the example we keep coming back to, generally the answer is no. So yeah, you can sort of use that ownership as a gauge of is the percentile chance that he's going to be on the lineup, the winning lineup, is this higher or lower than what I think it's actually going to be?
That's a great way to think of it. You mentioned earlier that it's position dependent for you. So let's kind of go through some of these positions and talk about how we think about ownership differently.
Right.
Starting at the running back position, I personally am the most keen to just play the chalk at the running back position. I think it is the most straightforward and easiest position to project. So that helps in terms of the industry is going to be right on the running backs more often than they're going to be right on all the other positions. That's one reason to play the chalk at running back. But I guess when you're looking for running backs to fade, or how are you most often getting to the conclusion of I'm going to fade the chalky running back on a particular slate, which might be a more interesting question for people?
Yeah, so I think running back is just like generally a pretty easy position to assess because it's, are they getting in the work, and then are they playing in an offense that scores points? You know, generally in the weeks where you do see an expensive running back, I mean, we keep coming back to the example, you know, Bijan Robinson at 40% ownership. That's probably because Atlanta has a very high implied team total, and because Bijan Robinson is playing 85-90% of the snaps, getting most of the goal line work, earning a ton of targets, and all that. I think where you can get in trouble, though, with running backs is that occasionally we will have guys who project very well because they earn a great workload, but maybe the offensive situation is pretty fragile. And I think a really good example is sort of late season Ashton Genty, where these late season Raiders implied team totals were 13.5, 14, 15 points, like absolutely brutal. But Genty's getting a ton of work. So, you know, when you run the projections, he's popping as a top 2, top 3, top 4 value. And especially as, you know, we get later in the season, some of the cheaper running backs who are earning strong workloads, you don't really see a lot of those guys if there aren't injuries on a slate. So, you know, it's sort of thinking through, like, with running backs, okay, if this offense actually only scores 14 points like Vegas says, what are the odds Ashton Genty can score 25 points and like totally bury me? It's probably not 35% like his projected ownership is suggesting. So that's the biggest thing that I look for running backs. I'm curious if you have anything to add there.
I couldn't put it any better. I don't really have anything more to add on running back. At wide receiver, we've made references to this throughout this show and throughout seemingly every show you and I do. It's our favorite thing is to just make fun of the chalky, low average depth of target wide receivers. It's Khalil Shakir. It's the Wan'Dale Robinsons, at least before 2025. It's Jacoby Myers. I would get this feeling, not that he's necessarily low ADOT, but we would get this with Jawan Jennings for some stretches of the past 2 seasons where it's like, yeah, he projects pretty well every single week. He's always going to project for like top 3 to top 5 in wide receiver ownership. But the chance that this particular player buries you is pretty low. Just because the only way it happens really is multiple touchdowns. It's not that this is like an especially efficient player that on a per touch or per target basis is going to be taking multiple 80-yard bombs to the house. Those are like the easiest fades in terms of wide receiver chalk for me. The toughest ones are usually, and especially this past NFL season in 2025, where the league kind of consolidated around like 4 really good wide receivers, and then there were no other good wide receivers after the top few guys. It got very, very hard to fade the Puka Nakuas, the Jamar Chases, the Jackson Smith and Jigbas of the world, like at the top of the wide receiver position, just because these were the only guys that were seeing like consistent week over week, double-digit targets, have multi-touchdown upside. All of those are like efficient players that can get deep and can bury you. Those are like the hardest types to fade. Anything to add kind of at wide receiver, Jake, or anything I'm forgetting to mention?
No, I mean, I think you really nailed it. I think the only other thing I'd throw in there is, like, especially as we get later into the season, you can use the Fantasy Points data suite to sort of get an idea of which wide receivers have the best red zone roles. And sometimes that can also include, like, looking at which guys are playing the most in the red zone. I know that's something we've talked about with a guy like Josh Downs, where, you know, outside of the 20s, he's out there for maybe 75% of snaps, but then inside the 20s, that drops to something like 50%. So even on the weeks where a guy like Josh Downs projects pretty well, it's like, okay, well, he's getting these lower ADOT targets. He's explosive, but probably not explosive enough to break off a long catch, and he's not really earning much of a red zone role. I think I feel pretty comfortable fading a guy like that because he's not going to bury you with multiple touchdowns. He probably won't hit the 100-yard bonus. So that's another thing that I like to be sort of conscious of when I'm looking at wide receiver chalk.
Moving over to tight end chalk, I think in most seasons, this is the easiest to fade with like very specific exceptions where for a lot of 2025, Trey McBride was just priced like a kind of low end wide receiver 1. Like he might have been like the wide receiver 10 by salary on a given slate if you just considered him a wide receiver. But we would every single week would project him as like, oh, this is the wide receiver 3. He has all these multi-touchdown games, all of these massive fantasy point performances. That's tight end chalk that's very hard to fade because the workload is much more projectable than any other tight end. The multi-touchdown upside is obviously there. Trey McBride had a stretch where it became pretty obvious after a couple weeks to like, you don't fade the tight end chalk when the tight end chalk is Trey McBride. But for a lot of 2024, it was the total opposite where Trey McBride was not, I just keep picking on him. This could be any particular player at the top of the tight end ownership, but because McBride was like Jekyll and Hyde in these 2 seasons, he just wasn't scoring touchdowns in 2024. The Cardinals' offense was just generally much less efficient, or at least they weren't getting into these game scripts every single week where Jacoby Brissett is going to drop back 40 times. That just kind of wasn't how they were playing. Yet he kind of had the Jacoby Myers problem where Trey McBride is going to project for a large share of the Cardinals offense every single week. He's usually going to project very well. He'll be a good fantasy point per dollar value. But the Cardinals maybe weren't having like the highest implied team totals. Like it was pretty easy to say, oh, well, if the field is going to play 20% of a tight end at the position that is the most random and the most touchdown reliant of any position in fantasy football, I'm just going to fade the chalky tight end. And I think that was the correct move for a lot of 2024 and even in 2025 slates where someone like a Dalton Schultz might end up as the chalkiest tight end on the slate, or a Hunter Henry, or these types of players where really all that has to go wrong for them is that they don't catch a touchdown and any other tight end on the slate catches 2, and you just massively benefit by fading the chalky tight end. I think that's usually the easiest place to, like outside of the exceptions, I think that's like the easiest place to immediately say in a lineup, I'm going to get different by fading the cash tight end, maybe just playing the tight end with my quarterback, correlating him. That's very easy usually to kind of jam in. Anything else on the tight end position that I'm forgetting here, Jake?
You nailed it. Like, if I am going to pay up for a chalky tight end, it's almost always because he's a power law type of player. Like Trey McBride this past year, Travis Kelce in 2019, 2020, 2021, where, and I think like Ryan sort of hinted at this, but like the easiest way to sort of figure that out is look at their expected fantasy points per game and then compare that to similarly priced wide receivers. If they're running laps around wide receivers in the same price range, I generally feel pretty comfortable playing those guys into like 25, 30% ownership. And then I think Ryan also gave a pretty good example on the opposite end where there will be slates where maybe there is no Trey McBride, maybe there is no Brock Bowers. All of a sudden things start to look pretty gross at the position overall, and then your most chalky tight end is like a $4,100 Dalton Schultz who's playing on a team with sort of a mediocre implied team total, and his usage is only okay, not dramatically better than any other tight end, maybe a little bit better than some of the wide receivers in his price range. If a guy like that's going to be 25 or 30% owned, I'm generally fine just going to whoever the second, third, fourth highest projected tight end is, because, yeah, especially when we're talking cheaper tight ends, it really just comes down to these guys falling into the end zone, and touchdowns are some of the hardest things to project accurately. So definitely, those are the spots where I would want to take my stance relative to ownership.
Finally, let's talk about the quarterback position. I know you have a lot of thoughts at QB, Jake, so I'm just going to turn it right over to you. I guess I'll set the scene a little bit, which is in 2025, I think we, for most of the season, saw extremely flat ownership for a lot of different main slates at the quarterback position. Even like 2 years ago, there would be several weeks where we would get like an 18 to 20% projected ownership quarterback in a given week. That was pretty rare in 2025. So how have you kind of changed your approach to the quarterback position, to quarterback chalk, and what's your general way of evaluating it?
Yeah, so quarterback is the position that you will see the flattest ownership at sort of week after week. I would say typically, and this can always change depending on how DraftKings alters pricing, but typically you will see the chalkiest quarterback in a given week somewhere in that 12 to 15% range. That said, though, I'm generally not too worried about quarterback chalk, and I think the reason for that is pretty easy to understand. I'm going to use late season Trevor Lawrence as a good example here. Is a bit different depending on the player, but we'll start with Trevor Lawrence. Later in the year, he was projecting really well because he was playing really well. The Jaguars were also drawing some decent matchups, and so it's easy to look at a guy like Trevor Lawrence and say kind of a gross quarterback to play, even though he's projecting well, 17% ownership, I might want to go elsewhere. Well, the thing was, he had 4 different pass catchers who were viable to use in stacks. So it was always, even if you were leaning into the Trevor Lawrence chalk, it was always very easy to make a lineup that still included a couple guys in that single-digit range. You could throw in a Brian Thomas Jr., a Brenton Strange, even a Parker Washington before he sort of took off later in the year, and still get a fairly low-owned stack. On the opposite end there are occasionally stacks. I'm having a hard time thinking of a great example off the top of my head, but maybe like a week where, say, like Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins are all projecting incredibly well, and there really aren't any other great options to mix in with the Bengals. If Joe Burrow is going to be 15%, T. Higgins is projecting for 20%, and Jamar Chase is projecting for 35%, it feels pretty easy to say that, like, okay, maybe 8% of all lineups in the field will have Joe Burrow plus T. Higgins plus Jamar Chase. Now all of a sudden, I mean, you can still make a unique lineup, but you just have to get different elsewhere. So that's generally why I'm not too concerned with quarterback ownership specifically. I'm more thinking about what's the cumulative ownership going to be of the most popular stack, and are there sort of different avenues, different roads I can go down when I'm building a lineup to pair a quarterback with his lesser owned pass catchers. So that's generally how I'm viewing quarterback ownership. I really don't mind leaning into the chalkiest quarterbacks, especially if I think I can build unique lineups using sort of different pass catchers than the field might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I do think at quarterback, it is important to think about the ownership of the stack or of the lineup that you're going to build around that quarterback more so than just the ownership number on that one particular QB. Another way you can kind of do this is that I'll very often during the season say, oh, okay, Trevor Lawrence is going to be very chalky and it's this particular stack. And maybe I do still want to play like the Trevor Lawrence plus Parker Washington plus Jakobi Meyers double that is going to be the most popular. But then I might look on the other side of the game and say, oh, if they're playing whatever, I don't know, if they're playing the Colts and Alec Pierce is going to be the chalkiest bring back option, and nobody's going to play Michael Pittman, or nobody's going to play, Josh Downs or whatever, or Jonathan Taylor, or there's like a way to get different on the bring back. I think that's another reason to say, okay, I'm fine leaning in to this chalky quarterback because I can still get more unique on the bring back in a way that's still correlated without having to worry about, oh, I'm playing the chalkiest quarterback. Like these are other considerations that are going through my mind.
Yeah, I think my final thought on this is I think there's also another way you could sort of take that where, say, Tampa Bay and Carolina is projecting or has a very high game total, and everyone wants to lean into that game, and most of the field is kind of in agreement that the Tampa Bay side is the way to stack that game up. Well, is the Tampa Bay side really going to put up huge numbers without the Carolina side putting up some sort of a fight? Maybe playing Bryce Young plus his pass catchers and then a couple Tampa Bay bringbacks is the way to go. So, yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can look at quarterback chalk, and I do think that's sort of the easiest ownership numbers, not to necessarily ignore, but to work around when you're building lineups.
Thanks so much for joining me, Jake, and thank you to the listeners for joining us today on DFS Deep Dive. If we've gotten the juices flowing, if you're intrigued, if you're ready to jump into the world of Fantasy Points DFS, you can head over to fantasypoints.com and subscribe for the upcoming season. With promo code DFS, our Fantasy Pro package runs through March 2027. It'll give you access to all our projections, tools, and content for both the upcoming UFL spring football season, which kicks off off on March 27th and the entire 2026 NFL season as well. You can also get into our subscriber Discord, or you can go for the Fantasy Bundle subscription. That'll also give you access to the Fantasy Points data suite, all of the other content we have at Fantasy Points. Have an amazing rest of your guys' day, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboard. Hopefully you didn't hear that siren come in at the end. What the hell?